The sun had barely risen when Matthew Anderson dove into the Olympic pool at the Atlanta Sports Complex. The cold water on that February morning in 2019 felt more comforting than usual. At 13, he was already a promising swimmer in Georgia, with dozens of medals hanging on his bedroom wall. "2 more laps, Matthew. Keep the pace," Coach Thompson shouted from the poolside, stopwatch in hand. His attentive eyes followed every movement of the young athlete, cutting through the water with surgical precision. In the stands, Helen Anderson watched her son with a mixture of pride and apprehension. Since her husband Richard had left on a missionary trip to Africa 3 months ago, she had been dividing her time between working as a nurse at Emory University Hospital and unconditionally supporting her son's sports career. "He's different. Today," she murmured to herself, noticing something strange in the way Matthew swam. There was an unusual lightness in his movements, as if he were floating more than normal. In the pool, Matthew felt something inexplicable. Each stroke seemed to take him not just through the water, but through invisible dimensions. The bubbles escaping from his mouth formed hypnotic patterns that made him momentarily lose sense of where he was. It was on the last lap of the 400-meter medley that everything changed. "Something's wrong," thought Thompson, noticing a sudden change in his athlete's rhythm. Before he could shout any instructions, he saw Matthew's body abruptly decelerate. Time seemed to freeze. Helen felt it before she saw it. An icy chill ran down her spine, and her years of experience as a nurse made her body react even before her mind processed what was happening. She was already running towards the pool when the first scream cut through the air. "Matthew!" The young swimmer's body floated motionless in the center lane. Thompson dove in without hesitation, while other athletes training in nearby lanes stopped, paralyzed by shock. Meanwhile, somewhere between this world and the next, Matthew was experiencing something that would change his life forever. His first thought was confusion. He could see his own body being pulled from the pool, could see Thompson starting resuscitation procedures, could see his mother running desperately, but he felt no fear. It was like watching a movie in which he no longer played a part. "Son, hang in there," Helen shouted, her experienced hands already taking control of the situation. "Call an ambulance now!" But Matthew was no longer there. His spirit had been pulled into a tunnel of darkness that seemed to suck in all the light around it. The air, if he still needed air, was getting denser and denser, as if the darkness itself was breathing. At the sports complex, chaos had set in. Ambulance sirens cut through the morning quiet, paramedics rushed in with equipment, athletes cried in each other's arms. The 9 minutes and 36 seconds that followed would seem like an eternity to all present. But for Matthew, it was just beginning. In his new state of consciousness, he began to hear voices. They weren't ordinary voices. They were whispers, in a language he had never heard before, but which, inexplicably, he could understand. They were laments, pleas, cries of despair that seemed to come from all directions. At the hospital, a few miles away, Dr. Elizabeth Moore was preparing for another shift when she received the alert. Something about this particular case made her feel an inexplicable tightness in her chest. She didn't know it, but her connection to what was about to happen would change not only her life, but her very understanding of reality. The darkness surrounding Matthew began to take shape. Shadows danced around him, some seeming to have faces distorted by agony. He tried to scream but had no voice. He tried to move but had no body. The terror he felt was different from anything he had ever experienced. It was a primordial fear that seemed to come from the soul itself. That's when it happened. A light. Not an ordinary light, but something so intense and pure that it made the darkness recoil as if it were alive and in pain. And with the light came a presence that Matthew instantly recognized, though he had never seen it before. It was Jesus. Not the Jesus of church-stained glass windows or Renaissance paintings. It was a presence of indescribable glory, emanating a love so intense that Matthew felt as if his being was being reconstituted just by being in front of him. "Matthew," the voice sounded, and the entire universe seemed to vibrate with that sound. At the sports complex, paramedics continued their resuscitation attempts. Helen held her son's hand, her prayers mixing with the tears she couldn't contain. Thompson remained by her side, his usual strong posture completely broken by the powerlessness in the face of the situation. And so on that seemingly ordinary February morning, a journey began that would transcend the boundaries between life and death, between the natural and the supernatural, between the known and the inexplicable. A journey that would not only change Matthew Anderson's life, but would bring to light truths that the world desperately needed to hear. In Jesus' presence, Matthew felt his being vibrate with inexplicable intensity. The love emanating from that glorious figure was overwhelming, but there was also a deep sadness in his gaze that made Matthew tremble to the core of his soul. "Come," said Jesus, and with a simple gesture, the entire environment around them transformed. Suddenly, Matthew found himself in front of an immense golden book whose pages shone with their own light. Names danced on the paper as if they were alive, some shining like liquid gold, others slowly fading until they almost disappeared. "This is the book of life," explained Jesus, his voice reverberating through invisible dimensions. "Each name here represents a soul. Observe." Matthew watched, horrified, as some names began to erase themselves letter by letter. "Why is this happening?" he asked, his mental voice trembling. "These are those who once knew me, but chose other paths," Jesus replied, and the sadness in his voice was palpable. At the hospital, Dr. Elizabeth Moore worked tirelessly on Matthew's body. Something about this case intrigued her deeply. In her 20 years of medicine, she had never felt such a strong connection to a patient. "There's still no response," she murmured to Helen, who waited anxiously in the hallway. "But there's something different here, I can feel it." Back to the spiritual experience, Jesus led Matthew through a portal of light. What he saw next left him speechless. His own life, like a three-dimensional film, unfolded before him. Every moment, every choice, every word spoken or unspoken, had consequences that extended far beyond what he could imagine. "See how your actions affect others," said Jesus, showing how a simple act of kindness that Matthew had done years ago, sharing his lunch with a classmate who was going hungry, had triggered a series of positive events in that person's life. But then came the difficult scenes. Harsh words spoken in moments of anger, small lies that seemed insignificant, moments when he chose to ignore someone who needed help. Each negative action created waves of darkness that spread, affecting lives he didn't even know. At the hospital, Dr. Moore noticed something strange on the monitors. The brain patterns. "I've never seen anything like this," she said to her team. The waves on the electroencephalogram formed impossible patterns, as if Matthew's brain was operating in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Helen, outside the emergency room, felt something that went beyond maternal concern. As a nurse, she had witnessed many critical cases, but there was something different happening with her son. Her prayers became more intense, and she began to feel a supernatural presence in the hospital corridor. In Africa, Richard Anderson woke up startled in his missionary cabin. A vivid dream about Matthew had awakened him, and he felt an inexplicable urgency to pray. Not knowing what was happening in Atlanta, he fell to his knees and began to intercede for his son. Jesus then took Matthew to a place he wished he had never known, hell. It wasn't like the artistic representations he had seen. It was a place of total separation from God, where the very absence of hope had weight and substance. "These chose to reject love," explained Jesus, as Matthew watched horrified, people he recognized, some who even attended churches. They all repeated the same anguishing phrase, "I thought I still had time." Back at the hospital, something extraordinary began to happen. Patients in other wards began to report inexplicable experiences. Some swore they saw golden lights in the corridors. Others said they felt an inexplicable peace. A terminally ill lady began to improve inexplicably. Dr. Moore, traditionally skeptical of supernatural events, could no longer deny that something beyond scientific understanding was occurring. The devices in Matthew's room began to display impossible readings, and a soft light, which no one could explain, seemed to emanate from the boy's body. At the sports complex, Thompson remained seated in the stands, mentally reviewing the morning's events. As a coach, he had always prided himself on his pragmatism, but something about what had happened to Matthew defied all logic. He could swear that at the moment the boy stopped swimming, he saw a golden light envelop his body. Jesus then showed Matthew visions of the future. He saw a generation being deceived by subtle lies, saw demons whispering in people's ears that being a good person is enough, that God doesn't judge, that there's plenty of time. He saw packed churches where people knew religion but didn't truly know God. "Time is running out, Matthew," said Jesus, his voice now laden with urgency. "You need to go back. They need to know the truth." The return to life was like emerging from an infinite ocean. Matthew opened his eyes in the ICU of Emory University Hospital, and the first thing he saw was Dr. Moore's face, illuminated by an expression of astonishment and relief. Behind her, his mother Helen cried silently, her prayers of gratitude filling the air. 9 minutes and 36 seconds, whispered Dr. Moore, checking the monitors with incredulity. "It's a miracle." But Matthew knew it wasn't just a miracle, it was a mission. His eyes now saw beyond physical appearances. In the corner of the room, a shadow moved, retreating from his gaze. The hospital walls seemed translucent, revealing different layers of reality he had never perceived before. "Mum," he called weakly, "I need to tell you something important." Helen approached, holding her son's hand, but before Matthew could continue, a nurse rushed into the room. "Dr. Moore, something extraordinary is happening in the terminal ward," she said, breathless. "Mrs. Johnson, the one with end-stage cancer. She's walking the corridors completely cured." The doctor looked at Matthew, then at the monitors and then at the nurse. In her years of practice, she had never witnessed anything like it. "This is impossible," she muttered, but knew that the word impossible had lost its meaning in the last few hours. In the corridor, other patients reported inexplicable experiences. A child with paralysis began to move their arms. A man in a coma for months opened his eyes. It was as if a wave of healing was spreading through the hospital, emanating from the room where Matthew had returned to life. In his cabin in Africa, Richard Anderson received a call that brought him to his knees. "Your son is alive," said the voice on the other end of the line, "but there's something different about him." Richard knew deep in his soul that what had happened to Matthew wasn't just an accident, it was part of a greater plan. Back at Ime Chandi, the hospital, Matthew began to share his experience. Every word that came out of his mouth seemed charged with supernatural power. Dr. Moore, who had begun to take notes for medical protocol, noticed that her hands were shaking as she wrote. "I saw the book of life," said Matthew, his voice gaining strength. "I saw names being erased. I saw people who thought they were saved, but were getting lost. Time is running out." Helen watched her son with a mixture of love and apprehension. Something had fundamentally changed in him. His eyes seemed older, wiser, as if they had contemplated eternities. At the sports complex, Thompson received constant calls from other athletes and parents wanting to know about Matthew. What had happened in the pool that morning had spread quickly, and different versions of the story began to circulate around the city. "He saw a light," some said. "The pool turned golden," others claimed. "Time stopped," whispered those who were present. At night, when the hospital finally quieted down, Matthew had his first proof that his mission would not be easy. At 3 in the morning, he woke up feeling an evil presence in the room. The temperature dropped drastically, and the shadows in the corners seemed to come to life. "They won't believe you," a voice whispered in his ear. "They'll call you crazy, a liar." But Matthew felt no fear. The experience with Jesus had changed something fundamental in his soul. He sat up in bed and, to the astonishment of the nurse doing her rounds, began to pray in a language no one knew. The shadows retreated, but Matthew knew that this was just the beginning. The spiritual battle that would unfold in the coming days would be more intense than any swimming competition he had ever faced. The next morning, Dr. Moore arrived early at the hospital, carrying a stack of scientific articles on near-death experiences. But when she entered Matthew's room, she found something that no scientific article could explain. The boy was sitting on the bed, talking to his mother, and a soft light, almost imperceptible, seemed to emanate from his body. "I need to tell everyone," he was saying. It's not about religion, it's not about church, it's about time, about choices, about eternity. Helen held her son's hand, silent tears running down her face. As a nurse, she had seen many patients return from critical situations, but never like this. As a mother, her heart was divided between pride and fear of what was to come. The news spread through Atlanta like wildfire. Within a week of Matthew's return, Emory University Hospital had transformed into a pilgrimage center. People from all parts of the United States began to arrive, hoping to witness the miracles that, according to rumors, were happening near the young boy. "This is getting out of control," said Dr. Moore during an emergency meeting with the hospital board. "We have lines forming in the corridors, sick people traveling from far away." But how to deny the inexplicable? Mrs. Johnson, now completely cured of cancer, had become a local celebrity. Her before and after exams circulated among doctors, defying all scientific logic. In Matthew's room, Helen tried to protect her son from the growing tumult. "You need to rest," she insisted, worried about the intense glow in the boy's eyes, which seemed to consume his physical energy. "I can't rest, Mum," Matthew replied, his voice carrying a maturity that didn't match his 13 years. "Every minute is precious now. They need to know." In Africa, Richard Anderson finally managed to get a flight back to the United States. During the flight, he had a vivid dream. He saw his son at the center of a spiritual storm, lights and shadows battling around him. He woke up startled, knowing he needed to get home as soon as possible. At the sports complex, Thompson faced his own crisis. The pool where everything had happened had become a site of constant visits. Some swore they saw golden reflections in the water. Others said they felt an inexplicable peace when approaching it. "The kid was always special," he commented to a reporter interviewing him. "But this is different from anything I've ever seen." One afternoon, while Matthew was talking to some visitors in his room, a woman entered carrying her 5-year-old daughter, who suffered from a rare degenerative disease. "Please," she begged, "they say you can help." Matthew looked at the girl and saw beyond her physical body. He could see the spiritual chains that bound her, could see the disease as a living shadow feeding on her vital energy. "It's not me who heals," he said softly, "but I can show the way to who heals." At that moment, something extraordinary happened. As Matthew prayed, everyone in the room began to feel a tangible presence. The temperature changed, and a soft light like dawn filled the environment. The girl, who hadn't been able to stand for months, suddenly straightened up in her mother's arms. Her eyes, previously clouded by the disease, shone with renewed life. Dr. Moore, who was observing from the door, felt her scientific certainties shake. As a doctor, she had dedicated her life to science, but what she was witnessing now went beyond any rational explanation. That night, after everyone had left, Matthew faced his most difficult moment yet. The shadows in the corners of the room began to multiply, and whispering voices filled his ears. "You're causing chaos," they said. "You're disturbing the natural order. You must stop." But then, something unexpected happened. Mrs. Johnson, who was passing through the corridor, heard the malignant whispers. Without hesitation, she entered the room and began to pray. Her faith, strengthened by her own miraculous healing, created a shield of light that made the shadows retreat. "You're not alone in this battle, boy," she said, holding Matthew's hand. The next day, a television crew arrived at the hospital. The story had reached national news. As the cameras prepared for an interview, Matthew felt a tightness in his chest. Jesus had shown him that his testimony needed to be heard, but had also warned him about the dangers of premature exposure. "It's not about me," he said when the cameras started rolling. "It's about a warning that needs to be heard. Time is running out, and many are spiritually asleep." His words, broadcast live, caused an immediate impact. In the television studios, equipment began experiencing inexplicable interference. Viewers reported seeing a golden aura around the boy during the transmission. Matthew's television interview triggered a storm of reactions. While thousands of people were touched by his message, other voices began to rise against him. Central Hospital found itself at the center of a controversy. that went beyond the boundaries of medicine. "We need to transfer him home," Dr. Elizabeth decided after a tense meeting with the board. "The hospital can no longer handle this situation." But the real battle was just beginning. On the morning Matthew was discharged, a delegation of traditional religious leaders was waiting at the hospital entrance. Among them was Father Joseph Anthony, known for his skepticism towards supernatural manifestations, and Pastor Samuel, who viewed any spiritual event outside his denomination with suspicion. "The boy is causing confusion among the faithful," Pastor Samuel argued before the cameras. "People are abandoning their churches to come here." Richard Anderson, who had finally returned from Africa, faced the group with a serenity that only years of missionary work could provide. "My son didn't come to bring division," he said, "but a warning that everyone needs to hear, regardless of religion." At home, Matthew faced his own challenges. The spiritual visions were becoming increasingly intense. During the night, he could see angelic beings guarding his house, while shadowy entities lurked in the corners, waiting for any opening. Helen found her son one early morning praying in the backyard. A soft light emanated from him, and the plants around him seemed more alive, more vibrant. "They're preparing something, Mom," he said, his eyes fixed on something only he could see. "They want to discredit me. They want to silence the message." In the same week, a group of doctors published an article suggesting that Matthew's experience was the result of hallucinations caused by lack of oxygen. Dr. Elizabeth, who had meticulously documented all the inexplicable events at the hospital, found herself in a professional dilemma. "I can't ignore what I saw," she said during a medical conference, her voice trembling slightly. "As a scientist, I must seek the truth, even when it challenges our certainties." Her position cost her dearly. Colleagues began to avoid her, and rumors about her professional capacity started circulating in the hospital corridors. Meanwhile, Mrs. Connie organized a group of people who had been healed through Matthew's ministry. They met regularly to pray and share testimonies, forming a network of spiritual protection around the boy. "It's not a coincidence that we were healed," she said during one of the meetings. "Each of us has a role in this story." One day, during one of these meetings, something extraordinary happened. As Matthew shared more details of his experience in heaven, a tangible presence filled the room. Everyone present began to see what he saw, a spiritual dimension overlaid on physical reality. "The veil is thinner now," Matthew explained. "Others will begin to see too. It's part of the warning." At the local church, Pastor Samuel faced a crisis of conscience. After publicly criticizing Matthew, he began having disturbing dreams. In one of them, he saw himself before the same book of life the boy had described and woke up drenched in sweat upon seeing his own name beginning to fade. Dr. Elizabeth, in turn, began to notice inexplicable changes in her own perception. Her patients were no longer just bodies with symptoms. She could feel their emotional pains, their spiritual battles. "What's happening to me?" she asked Matthew during a visit. "You're awakening," he replied simply. "Many will awaken in the coming days. It's necessary for what's to come." Richard, observing all these transformations, began documenting each event, each testimony. His experience as a missionary had taught him to recognize the signs of the times, and something in his spirit told him they were living a crucial moment in the spiritual history of the United States. Denver dawned different that Monday. Throughout the city, people reported vivid dreams and inexplicable experiences. The veil between the natural and the supernatural seemed increasingly thin, exactly as Matthew had predicted. At the central parish, Father Joseph Anthony found his church packed, even before sunrise. People of different religions and even declared atheists sought answers for the experiences they were having. "I saw my name in the book," an elderly lady whispered during confession, tears running down her wrinkled face. "It was beginning to disappear." "What does that mean, Father?" The clergyman who days before had publicly criticized Matthew now found himself in a deep spiritual crisis. The night before, while praying in his private chapel, he had seen warrior angels positioned around his church, exactly as the boy had described in his interview. At Dr. Elizabeth's private clinic, the waiting line extended down the sidewalk. Her new ability to perceive the spiritual dimensions of diseases had become known, and people sought more than just medical treatment. "It's not just about healing the body," she explained to her team, who were also beginning to experience changes in their perception. "We are treating whole souls." Coach Thompson transformed the sports complex into a meeting point for young athletes who, like Matthew, sought more than just physical excellence. During training, moments of prayer and meditation became as important as the exercises. "Sport can be a path to spiritual awakening," he said, his voice carrying a conviction that surprised all who knew him before. At home, Matthew faced a new phase of his mission. His visions now included specific future events, and the urgency of his message increased each day. "I see people choosing paths," he said during a meeting with Mrs. Connie's group. "Every daily decision, no matter how small it seems, is creating waves in eternity." Helen, observing her son, noticed that the supernatural glow that enveloped him now seemed to infect those who remained in his presence for long. The plants in the garden bloomed out of season, and even stray animals seemed to be attracted by the energy emanating from the house. Richard, in turn, began receiving calls from other missionaries around the world. Similar events were happening in different countries, people having visions of the Book of Life, experiencing spiritual awakening, feeling an inexplicable urgency to seek the truth. "It's a global movement," he explained to a group of religious leaders who had gathered at his house. "What's happening here in Denver is just the beginning." Pastor Samuel, after his disturbing experiences, decided to visit Matthew. The meeting, which was supposed to be brief, extended for hours. When he finally left the Andersons' house, he was a transformed man. "We need to tear down the walls between denominations," he declared the following Sunday, to the astonishment of his congregation. "Time is too short for divisions." Dr. Elizabeth documented each new case that came to her clinic. People who had never demonstrated spiritual sensitivity began having profound experiences. Children, in particular, seemed more open to new perceptions. "They've always seen," Matthew explained when the doctor consulted him about the phenomenon. "We're the ones who lost that ability as we grew up. Now it's being restored." One afternoon, during one of the meetings at the Andersons' house, all those present experienced a collective vision. For a few minutes, they could see the world as Matthew saw it. The spiritual battles happening in the streets, angels guarding certain people, shadows trying to influence others. "Is it like this all the time?" someone asked, still trembling from the experience. "Every second," Matthew replied. "That's why the urgency. That's why the warning." Night had fallen over Denver when Matthew woke up startled. A powerful presence filled his room, more intense than anything he had experienced since his return. The light emanating was so bright that Helen and Richard ran to the room, finding their son kneeling, tears running down his face. "It's time," he said, his voice blended with supernatural authority. "Everyone needs to gather. Today." Richard immediately began making calls. Dr. Elizabeth, Pastor Samuel, Father Joseph Anthony, Mrs. Connie, all simultaneously felt an inexplicable call to the Andersons' house. In less than an hour, the room was packed. People from different denominations, social classes, and life stories, all united by a sense of spiritual urgency they couldn't explain. "What we're seeing is just the beginning," Matthew began, his eyes shining with knowledge beyond his years. "When I was on the other side, Jesus showed me more, much more." The air in the room became dense, charged with expectation. The walls seemed to pulse with supernatural energy, and all present could feel they were about to witness something extraordinary. "We've been trained to see life in small slices," he continued. "Days, weeks, years. But in eternity, time is different. Every choice we make creates waves that affect not only our future, but the future of countless other souls." As he spoke, a vision began to manifest in the center of the room. Like a three-dimensional projection, everyone could see lines of light intertwining, representing the connections between human choices and their eternal consequences. "Look," said Matthew, pointing to the patterns of light. "Every act of kindness, Every word of truth, every moment of genuine love, creates a wave of light that spreads through eternity. But there are also shadows. The lights transformed into a global map, revealing points of darkness and light scattered across the planet. Denver shone like a beacon, and lines of light extended from it to other cities, other countries. The awakening that began here is not by chance, he explained. It's part of a larger plan, a plan of restoration. Dr. Elizabeth, who had brought her notebook, realized her hands were shaking as she wrote. The implications of what she was witnessing surpassed any scientific understanding. For years, we've been conditioned to believe that the spiritual world and the physical are separate, Matthew continued, but they're not. They never were. The veil between dimensions is becoming thinner for a reason. Richard, who had spent years as a missionary, began to understand. The prophecies, he murmured. They all pointed to this. Yes, Dad, Matthew confirmed, but there's more, much more. The vision intensified, now showing scenes of the near future. Hospitals where doctors and pastors would work side by side, treating body and soul. Schools where children would learn both mathematics and spiritual discernment. Companies where decisions would be made based not only on profits, but on their eternal impact. What we're witnessing, said Matthew, his voice now heavy with emotion, is the beginning of a new era. An era where the natural and the supernatural will no longer be separated, where the church will not be defined by walls or denominations, but by the authenticity of the encounter with God. Pastor Samuel, tears streaming down his face, finally understood why his previous certainties had been shaken. Our divisions, he began, are part of what needs to be healed, completed Father Joseph Anthony, extending his hand to his former rival. The revelation at the Andersons' house had triggered a wave of transformation that no one could have predicted. In the weeks that followed, the message spread rapidly, but with it came also the forces that would try to prevent its propagation. It all began on a seemingly ordinary morning. Matthew woke up with an unshakable certainty. They're coming, he told his parents. The confrontation I saw on the other side is about to happen. The first manifestation occurred during a live interview on the country's largest television network. As Matthew shared his experience, the studio lights began to flicker, and a shadowy presence could be felt by all present. It's not a coincidence, he explained, maintaining calm while technicians rushed trying to solve the technical problems. They want to prevent the truth from being revealed. At Dr. Elizabeth's clinic, patients began reporting disturbing visions. Shadows moved through the corridors, and some swore they heard voices whispering messages of disbelief and hopelessness. It's a battle for the awakening of souls, the doctor said during an emergency meeting with the support group. Her scientific notes now included a new type of diagnosis, negative spiritual interference. Pastor Samuel and Father Joseph Anthony, now working in unity, organized prayer vigils in their communities. During one of these meetings, supernatural manifestations began to occur. People fell to the ground, overwhelmed by invisible forces, while others received visions of the spiritual world. It's as if two dimensions were colliding, observed Richard, remembering similar experiences he had witnessed in his years of mission. In Africa, Mrs. Connie, who had become a respected spiritual leader after her miraculous healing, gathered a group of intercessors. We need to form a wall of protection, she declared. What's at stake is bigger than we imagine. One night, while the city slept, Matthew had his most intense vision yet. He saw armies of angels strategically positioned throughout Denver, preparing for something grand. The confrontation won't be as people imagine, he explained the next morning. There won't be explosions or physical destruction. It will be a battle for truth, for the perception of reality. And so it began. In hospitals, schools, businesses, and homes, people began to simultaneously experience a forced awakening. It was as if the veil between dimensions was being completely torn, exposing both the divine and the shadowy. Dr. Elizabeth documented everything frantically. It's as if we're witnessing a separation, she observed, people being forced to choose between light and shadows, with no middle ground. At the sports complex, Coach Thompson gathered his athletes for a special session of spiritual training. Sport teaches us about discipline and perseverance, he said. Now we need to apply that to the spiritual battle. The manifestations reached their peak during an ecumenical gathering at the city's largest stadium. Thousands of people gathered to hear Matthew, but what they experienced went far beyond words. The sky above the stadium seemed to open, revealing spiritual dimensions that until then had been hidden. Angels and demons became visible to all present, and the battle Matthew had described materialized before the astonished eyes of the crowd. "Do not fear," his voice sounded through the loudspeakers, carrying supernatural authority. "What you're seeing is real. It has always been real. The difference is that now you can see." The day after the confrontation at the stadium dawned different in Denver. The sky had a golden hue that no one had ever seen before, and a supernatural peace hung over the city. People on the streets walked more slowly, as if each step now carried new meaning. At the Andersons' house, Matthew woke up renewed. The supernatural glow that had enveloped him since his death experience now seemed softer, more integrated into his physical presence. "It's as if two worlds have merged," he explained to his parents during breakfast. "There's no more separation between the natural and the supernatural. This is how it always should have been." Helen, preparing coffee, noticed that the kitchen plants had bloomed overnight. White roses sprouted in unlikely places, and the aroma they exuded seemed to carry memories of paradise. Dr. Elizabeth arrived early, her notebook overflowing with accounts of the last 24 hours. "The hospitals are different," she reported, still amazed. "Terminally ill patients report visions of angels. Some are being healed just by perceiving the spiritual reality around them." Pastor Samuel and Father. Joseph Anthony organized a joint celebration that gathered thousands of people in the city center. It was no longer a matter of religion or denomination. It was a pure expression of gratitude for the new awakening. "The walls have fallen," declared Pastor Samuel, embracing the priest. "Not just the walls between our churches, but the walls between worlds." Mrs. Connie, now recognized as one of the matriarchs of the movement, established spiritual guidance centers throughout the city. "Many are awakening to their gifts," she explained. "They need direction to use these new perceptions." Richard, using his missionary experience, began receiving calls from religious leaders from around the world. What had happened in Denver was spreading globally, each region experiencing its own unique awakening. "It's like a new Pentecost," he said during a video conference with missionaries from various countries. "But this time, it's not just the gift of tongues, it's the gift of truly seeing." At the sports complex, Coach Thompson transformed swimming classes into integral training sessions. Athletes not only learned swimming techniques, but also how to perceive and work with the spiritual currents present in the water. "Sport has always been more than physical," he explained. "Now we can see and work with all its dimensions." Matthew, accompanied by his parents and Dr. Elizabeth, visited various points in the city. At each location, people approached not just to ask for healing or advice, but to share their own awakening experiences. "Each person is having their own encounter with truth," he observed. "It's different for everyone, but they all are part of the same movement." At a local public school, children began to draw what they saw. Angels guarding the corridors, golden lights enveloping their teachers, colors that didn't exist in the normal visible spectrum. The principal, instead of discouraging, created a special space for these expressions. "Children have always known," Matthew said when visiting the drawing exhibition. "They never completely lost the ability to see beyond." At night, the city took on a new life. Spiritual lights danced between buildings, and the stars seemed closer, more connected to the earth. People gathered spontaneously in squares and parks, sharing stories and experiences. Dr. Elizabeth, in her clinic, began officially integrating spiritual treatment with traditional medicine. "It's no longer possible to separate," she explained to her team. "Every disease, every cure has its physical and spiritual dimensions." 6 months passed since the great confrontation at the stadium. Denver had transformed into a spiritual beacon, attracting people from all corners of the world. What had begun with the near-death experience of a 13-year-old boy had now become a global movement of spiritual awakening. Matthew, now 14, remained serene in the face of all the transformation. On a special morning, he gathered in his house those who had been with him since the beginning. His parents, Dr. Elizabeth, Pastor Samuel, Father Joseph, Mrs. Connie, and Coach Thompson. "It's time to share the last part of the revelation," announced, his eyes shining with that supernatural light that everyone could now clearly see. The group settled in the living room, where everything had begun. The white roses that sprouted spontaneously throughout the garden exhaled their celestial perfume, creating an atmosphere of natural holiness. "What we've lived through so far was just the beginning," Matthew began. "The true purpose of all this goes beyond spiritual awakening. It's about the complete restoration of humanity's original purpose." As he spoke, images began to form in the air around him, like a living, three-dimensional projection. Everyone could see scenes of the future unfolding. Hospitals where spiritual and physical healing happened in perfect harmony, schools where children learned about both science and their spiritual gifts, businesses guided by eternal principles instead of temporary profits. "The separation between sacred and secular was never God's plan," he continued. "What we're experiencing is the restoration of the original vision, a world where the natural and supernatural coexist in perfect harmony." Dr. Elizabeth, who had meticulously documented the entire journey, shared her most recent discoveries. "Medicine is transforming," she explained. "We no longer treat just bodies or minds, but whole beings. Healing rates have increased exponentially since we began incorporating the spiritual dimension into treatment." Pastor Samuel and Father Joseph, now true friends, reported how their congregations had transformed. "There are no more barriers," said the pastor. "People no longer come to church to fulfill a ritual, but to celebrate a reality they live daily." "Faith is no longer something abstract," added the priest. "Now it's a tangible, visible, real experience." Mrs. Connie, with tears in her eyes, shared stories from the spiritual guidance centers she had established. People who had never thought about God are having profound encounters with the divine. Lives are being transformed daily. Richard, recently returned from an international trip, reported how the movement had spread. From Africa to Asia, from Europe to the Americas, each region is experiencing its own unique awakening. It's as if the whole world is remembering a long-forgotten truth. Hannah, observing everything with maternal eyes, realized that her son had fulfilled a much greater purpose than anyone could have imagined. "When you left that day at the pool," she said, "it was to bring back something we had lost." Matthew smiled, that smile that mixed childlike innocence with eternal wisdom. "Time is being fulfilled," he said. "What began as a warning has become an invitation for all humanity, an invitation to truly see reality as it is." Coach Thompson, who had transformed the sports complex into a comprehensive training center, shared how athletes now competed with a new awareness. "It's no longer about medals," he explained. "It's about manifesting God's glory through sport." As the afternoon progressed, a familiar presence filled the room, the same presence Matthew had encountered during his near-death experience. Everyone could feel the unconditional love emanating from it, and finally understood the greater purpose of everything they had lived through. "The veil will never close again," Matthew declared, his words carrying supernatural authority. "What has been revealed will remain. What has been awakened will stay awake. This is the legacy we will leave for future generations, a world where heaven and earth meet, where the natural and supernatural dance together, where each person can see and experience the full reality of God's creation." And so what had begun as a near-death experience of a 13-year-old boy transformed into a new chapter in human history. The warning that the world needed to hear had become a reality, that the world could now see, touch, and live.